Church. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to James. We'll be reading James 5, 7 through 12. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation.
Awesome. Good morning to see everyone today. My name is Romej. I'm the Minister of Connections here at Aspire Church. It's so good to see you all. And you know what? I kind of have a high bar today because the last time that I gave a sermon was by far the best sermon that I've ever given. For those of you that are laughing, it was also my first sermon that I ever gave. So I suppose that also makes it the worst. But if you look at it that way, I feel like you can only go up from here. So it can only get better. Out of the passages that we just read today in James, which thank you, Foster, there's really two main topics that James discusses in these passages. The first topic is about patience. The next topic is about letting your yes be yes and your no be no. And I'd love to just dive in and see what it is that James has to tell us about patience. And it's a little bit funny that we come here at this time today talking about patience, because for myself, it's been a year and a half that I've actually been working with our church part-time. So a little over a year and a half ago, I actually went part-time at my job. I was working as an engineer full-time at Raytheon, and I started working part-time with our church. I've been working as an engineer for many years, and so now we're at a time where I'm actually working full-time for our church. So right when it happened, right off the bat, a year and a half ago when I went part-time, I was so excited. So excited to have this opportunity to work with the church, something that I never expected. And so right from there, my wife, Carly, and I, we were praying and thinking, is this somewhere that God is going to take us long-term? Is it going to be a day that I'm actually going to be able to commit full-time to this? And so now I'm happy to announce to you guys and tell you that day is here. I'm so excited. And it's been, like I said, a little bit over a year and a half. And in that time, I surrounded myself in my small groups to pray for us and to pray through that transition. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that if you give me some sort of problem, I'm ready to come up with some ideas and figure out a way to fix it. Or if you tell me that God's doing something, I'm excited and I'm ready to figure out the next steps to how do I make that happen? And so a year and a half ago, when I went part-time and we were thinking, could this be it? I was ready to make a game plan for making it full-time. Now, luckily, Brian had challenged me. He said, you know what? He affirmed and encouraged that he too saw that this was the trajectory that it was going. And then he could tell that God was working in our lives. But he said, make sure that you do it in God's timing. So when we're talking about patience, we're going on 2 years of praying and thinking through that in our own life of what God is doing. And so when we get here into the book of James, let's just see what it is that James has to tell us about patience, because I feel like I've personally been living this out, and I think we all have to some degree. If not, we're probably about to. So it starts off in the book of James where he says, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains? You also be patient. Now, I don't know about you guys. How many farmers do we have out here? That's kind of what I thought. Well, I'm not a farmer either. But I tell you what, my mom, she grew up on a farm. She grew up on a farm with 13 total kids. So I have quite a few aunts and uncles that I could reach out to and ask about farming. And so I actually have an uncle who owns and runs the farm that my mom grew up on. So I actually called him up earlier this week, and I said, from a farmer's perspective, I'm looking at this passage, like, tell me a little bit of what it means from yourself. Like, I feel like I can understand it, but tell me what it means. And it was interesting to hear what he had to say. He said, still today, not just when James was written 2,000 years ago, but still today, many, many farmers are completely dependent on the weather. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine if your livelihood and your work was dependent on something like the weather? I mean, how many times do we expect it to rain and it doesn't? Or we expect it not to rain and it does, like when you're at a pumpkin patch, right? It's just where we went with our students yesterday. Or how many times as we're approaching the fall season, we're ready for it to cool down, and it's still 90-something degrees outside, right? And so can you imagine that your livelihood is dependent on something like that that's completely out of your control? He went on to tell me a little bit more about it and talk about how it mentions here the early and the late rains, and how if you don't get the early rains, then you may not be able to plant your seed. And if you do plant your seed and you don't get the late rains, then it may not grow. And how, as a farmer, if you are not patient, most of them don't make it as farmers, is what he was telling me. They usually end up with some sort of health problems and go on to do something else. But you know what? He's been doing farming for many years, and he said God somehow always provides. It's just not in the way that he always expects. Sometimes it is. But it's some way he provides. Sometimes you just have to go with the flow. If the crop isn't growing right, then what is it that I can plant before harvest that will grow? And I thought that was interesting to kind of hear what he had to say. And I also love how he said, you know, I don't get too excited anymore. And I know what he means. He's not talking about joy and excitement. He's talking about when things don't go his way, you got to figure out what it is that God is doing. And when thinking about farmers, because none of us here rose our hands as farmers, isn't that the same in our own life? How many times do we feel like we've got control over something? We feel like we've got our finances, our retirement, or just our daily job or our plan for the week. And then a pandemic hits, and we realize we really don't have control over things. And so here, when James is talking about being patient, we all know what he's talking about to some degree. As we continue to read down here, in verse 9, he goes on and he talks about, do not grumble against one another, brothers. Now, if you are in a small group here at Aspire Church, that verse might have stood out to you. Because in our small groups, most of them, we actually start off every night talking about these one another verses. What are these one another verses? Well, in the New Testament alone, there's over 50 verses that talk about one another. And so here when we get to James, we can see what does this have to do with us? Well, every time in the New Testament, when he's talking about one another, it's instruction for people within the church body on how to interact, how to behave with each other. And so today when it says, do not grumble against one another, right after talking about patience, we can use our small groups as an example. You know, like, how many times are you in your small group and someone shows up late? Well, James says, don't grumble about them. What about the person that's in your small group that talks a little bit too much? Or the one that just doesn't talk at all? Well, it says here, don't grumble about them. Now, there might be time for you to have that interaction, and there's always correction, and the Bible talks about that too. But here, it's good for us to know that this isn't just within our church, but this plays out in all of our life. And it talks about coming to the judge standing at the door, Jesus. And so that's not something that I want to have Jesus tell me and remind me, hey, remember after work, that hard day that you were having with your coworker and you went home and grumbled to your wife? Don't do that. So James is just telling us here to just be patient with one another. Don't grumble against each other. There's another thing that really stands out to me. So we read this and I see steadfast. Did anyone else notice the word steadfast? Where else have we seen that? I see a couple of you raise your hands. If you remember, in the beginning of James, he actually talked about steadfast. Right off the bat, James kicks off his book. He says, be steadfast and endure, when he was talking about going through trials. We see it again at the end of James. So this isn't a coincidence. This is actually a literary technique that authors would use to help the reader see that there's some sort of overall theme going on. So you see steadfast at the beginning and you see steadfast at the end. That's for us to say, okay, there's something going on here. There's something for me to listen in on. And so when we're talking today, there's something about patience, being steadfast and enduring for us all to take away from here. There's another thing that stands out to me. At the end, it talks about the purpose of the Lord. And I don't know about you, but when I see something about the purpose of the Lord, I kind of feel like I better pay attention. I feel like I should know what that means. What is the purpose of the Lord? James says, the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Okay. Here's a little Bible trivia for you guys. Where in the Bible does God first describe himself? And what does he say? So if you don't know, it actually is in the book of Exodus. So at this point in Exodus, just to give a little bit of background, Moses has just led all of the Israelites out of captivity. They've gone through the wilderness for 40 days. And at this point, Moses is on a mountaintop, and God actually comes down, and God starts to describe himself to Moses. Now, we've got many books of the Bible where other people are describing characteristics of God. We've got Psalms of David talking about God's vastness and his mercy and his wonderfulness. We've got other books in the Bible, and in fact, we even do that in small group, and together we try to describe the characteristics of God, and that's a good thing. But here, God is actually describing himself. The creator of the universe is telling us the kind of God he is. And so looking at Exodus 34:6, this is what it says. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. See, all James had to say was compassionate and merciful. The people of that time would have known exactly what he was talking about. In fact, they probably could have picked up on it, maybe finished off the verse. We kind of do something like this today. So I'll give you guys a couple of examples. For those of you that love your Netflix streaming, if I were to say the Upside Down, does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, we got some Stranger fans in here. That's right, Stranger Things fans. That's right. Okay, see? How about this? If I say the phrase Friday Night Lights, who here thought of football? Anybody? Okay. I didn't say anything about football, did I? I said Friday Night Lights, yet many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you thought about football. I've got one more for you guys. What about this? Did anyone on their way in today stop and get a venti? Okay, you might have thought of two things, a large cup of coffee and Starbucks. Yet I didn't say anything to do with either of those items, right? I said the word venti. So if I was writing a letter to someone today and I talked about a venti, I wouldn't have to describe to them that I'm talking about Starbucks or that it's coffee. They would know what I'm talking about. And if that was somehow important in my letter, they would get it. But someone 100 years from now, or 200 or 2,000 years from now that reads that letter, far after Starbucks is gone, would have no idea what in the world I'm talking about. So today, when we see that in James, it's the same thing. When he says compassionate and merciful, their brains know exactly what he's talking about. In fact, they're probably thinking about everything in their history that led them up to that point. They are thinking about how God is so compassionate and how slow to anger he is, even time after time that they've rebelled against him. As they're supposed to be following him, they'd be thinking about that. So when James says compassionate and merciful, he doesn't have to say anything else. We today have to take a little bit of time to kind of understand what does that mean there? Well, that's what it means. And as we continue to look at this, I was kind of preparing for today and wondering, well, James talks about some of the prophets and how steadfast they are. We talked about that steadfastness and how important that is. Which prophet should I use as an example for the sermon today? And as I was thinking through it, I figured, Rob, why don't you just not reinvent the wheel? James talks about Job, so why don't we talk a little bit about Job? Now, if you haven't read the book of Job, or if you have, Job is a decently long book. To put it into comparison, Job is 42 chapters. James, which we're going through now, is 5 chapters. We've been going through the book of James over the past 10 weeks. So Job is significantly bigger. And to kind of give you an overarching summary of the book of Job, the very first chapter is really setting up the story of what's about to happen in Job's life. You as the reader, we as the reader, get a glimpse into the background of what's happening. The last 4 chapters of Job is God's response to Job and everything that happened. All right, so if you did the math, those 37 chapters in the middle, what are those? Well, you learn right off the bat that Job is a very wealthy person. He's got a lot of things. It's kind of this Solomon-type figure. He's got a large family, a big flock. He's got houses. And he loses everything. And when I mean everything, he loses his houses. He loses his family. He loses his family's family. All of his livestock is gone. Everything is gone. We know that everybody in his life is gone except for his wife. And his wife tells him, Job, you should just curse God after all of this. It goes on, and not only does Job lose everything, but he gets sick. He's got boils all over his skin. He can't sit still, yet he can barely move. He can't eat. He can't get comfortable. And so Job is visited by 4 friends, and I'm not so sure that I would call them friends. Because for 37 chapters, Job's friends are telling Job how horrible of a person he must be. They're telling him that he must be a sinner after all of these things that have happened to him. Yet, you as the reader know from the very first chapter that he's done nothing wrong. And in fact, it's told us that Job is a very righteous person. And so for 37 chapters, his friends have come and told him how horrible of a person he is, and he's talked back and forth with them. And let me tell you this, not once in those 37 chapters does Job curse God. Now he's frustrated, he's angry, he's even angry at God, he's upset, but he refuses to curse God. Now that to me does sound like patience. It's no wonder that James uses Job as an example for patience. Speaking of patient, we started off this whole thing in talking about being steadfast, and I really think that all of James can be summarized by James 1:19, which says to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. We just heard about that, about God being slow to anger, right? And doesn't that sound like a patient person? Someone who's quick to listen to you but slow to speak? And so before we go on to our next topic, my challenge to you is this. How are you in the area of patience? As we look here, we know that our God is a patient God. We know that we can look at the prophets and kind of look at them as being steadfast. And we even get some actual ways that we can practice patience by being quick to listen and slow to speak. As we go on to our next topic, it's let your yes be yes and your no be no. Now, I love James because he is straight to the point, which just makes me smile. So let's take a look. Let's see what it is that he has to say. Verse 12, he says, but above all, let's pause for a moment. Above all of what? Well, if you remember, when we kicked off the series in James, Brian actually listed all of the topics that we would talk about through this book. So up to this point, we're at week 10. These are some of the topics that we've talked about. We've talked about being steadfast and enduring, about being quick to listen, about hearing the word and then doing it. We've talked about not being partial towards other people, having faith without works and how that would be meaningless. We've talked about taming the tongue and how no man can do it. We've compared wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world, and we've talked about worldliness in general and about boasting about tomorrow. And last week we talked about a warning to the rich. So we get here in James, and James says, but above all. He's meaning above all of these things. Read all of this together, above all of this. And we know, as we've been here for 10 weeks, all of those things are so important. So if he says above all, then it's time to lean in and listen. What is it that James has to tell us? If there's one thing that we can walk away from the book of James or walk away from today, it's what he has to tell us next. So let's see what that is. He goes on to say, do not swear by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. Now, this was a common practice in the day of James. This was very very often that people would say that they would do something on behalf or put it on a God. So they would say, I swear that I'll do this on my God in heaven. Or I promise on my father's lineage that I will do whatever it is. And James is saying, don't do that. He's saying, if you're going to do something, just do it. He says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. He's saying you don't need any of that stuff. And in fact, we actually do this today. How many times have you been talking with a friend of yours and you're in the middle of conversation and your friend says something like, well, let me be honest with you. Well, what were you just doing 3 seconds ago? Were you not being honest with me? Right? Or how about after someone was supposed to do something for you or with you and they fail to do it and they tell you, well, I promise that I'm going to do this the next time. Does just the words I promise supposed to make me feel better that you're going to do it? Or I swear on my life that I'm going to do whatever it is? See, James is saying, if you say you're going to do something, you don't need all of that other stuff. You don't need these extra words. As one who's following Jesus, if you say yes or you say no, then mean yes or mean no. You know, when I was working as an engineer in the office, I had this coworker of mine, and he came up, and he had been playing paintball like every single weekend. He had found out that when I was in high school, I played a lot of paintball. That was my thing. I played paintball a lot. So when he found that out, he invited me. He said, hey, would you come and would you play paintball with me? And I told him that I wouldn't be putting that on my calendar and that I wouldn't do that. And he looked at me kind of offended. And in fact, there might even be some people here today thinking, well, that was kind of rude. And so he said, why won't you come play paintball with me? I've asked other people in our office, and they all agreed to come. And so I paused, I took a moment, and I sat down and I talked with him. And I said, how many people in the office have you asked to go paintballing with you? And he said, well, most of the people that we mutually know, he had invited. I was like, wow, okay, that's a lot of people. So how many of them have actually gone paintballing with you? And he said, well, none. Maybe one, but really no one. So I thought, okay, well, would you have rather, and I asked him this, would you rather that when you asked them to go paintballing with you, that they be honest with you and tell you that they weren't going to come? Or would you rather them tell you honestly that they weren't going to make it? You know, or tell you that they're going to show up and then never come? And his response was, well, I wish they would just have been honest with me. And I said, see, I love you, man. It's not you. In that season, I knew in my life I had a lot of priorities. I had a lot of commitments with my church family. I had a lot of things that I was doing in my life. So I just knew that that wasn't going to be something I was going to put on my calendar. And because I had played paintball before, I knew it was an all-day commitment. It wasn't just an hour here. So I knew what I was also getting myself into, and I just told him, no, I wouldn't do that. But how many times in our life do we always expect a yes? Or do you always give a yes? You know, even today, like you meet an old friend, you bump into somebody at the store that you haven't seen in a long time, and you're like, hey, let's hang out. And you're like, yeah, that'd be great. And you have no intention of ever hanging out or getting together. Or you see someone on a Sunday morning, and maybe you want to hang out with someone. And so you say yes, but you never actually intend to put that on your calendar. Well, what I love about James is he tells us, well, there's really no in-between. If you look at the two options, there's no gray area, there's no maybe. He gives us yes, and he gives us no. You know, and for those of you that are Jesus followers out there, talking about your yes and your no, talking about priorities in your life, when you are a Jesus follower, did you know that God actually tells us what our priorities as a Jesus follower are? Now, if you're not a Jesus follower, you can prioritize your life however you want. But as a Jesus follower, these are what God tells us. God tells us that our number one priority should be God, spending time with him, getting away with him, praying with him, spending time in his word. Our number two priority should be our spouse, if you're married. And if you have kids, then that would be number three. And you should prioritize your family. After that, you prioritize your church family. Okay, so that means if you're not married and you don't have kids, that your church family come right after God. And then after that, you've got work and your hobbies and the things you like to do. But how many times do we take that work one that's fourth or fifth on the list and put it up at the front? and let that kind of control our life. Well, when you give your yes to God, you're also giving your yes to the things that he tells us to do. And our yes goes in so many areas. If you're a member of Aspire Church, then be a member of Aspire Church. Go to a small group. You know, and if you've been here long enough, you know that this is a church of small groups. And if this is your first time, we're not just a church with small groups. That's the heart of our church, is small groups. And so if you give your yes to Aspire, then be in a small group. If you say that you're going to give. If you say that you're going to show up to tear down, then show up and tear down. You know, we live in this culture, this ghosting culture, where if something feels a little bit uncomfortable or you just kind of wake up and don't want to do something, you just kind of sweep it under the rug and hope that no one will bring it up and just go on about your life. And most people don't bring it up. Well, stop it. Yeah. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. We talked about work. Don't let your work bully you into rearranging your priorities. If you give your yes to God, give your yes to God. And along those same lines, you know, Jesus even tells us if we choose to follow him, he tells us to be baptized. You know, and we know that baptism doesn't save. But if you commit your life to Jesus, he tells us to go and by obedience to be baptized. And you know what I think would be really cool? If you decide today to give your life to Jesus, we should have a baptism so you can follow up in that. Or for those of you who are following Jesus, but you haven't taken that step of obedience to be baptized, I think that we should have a baptism. Maybe we should have one next week, Brian. So for anybody that wants to be baptized, let's do it. Let's actually take the action in obedience and follow through with our words. So we hit this point about our yes and our no. And James here is really raising the bar of our words and our commitments to where they should be as Jesus followers. And it's pretty high. And so this can have a negative side effect that I think we just need to talk through. And that would be fear of making commitments in general. After all, if you're worried about making a yes and a no, why don't I just make no commitments at all? That way I don't have to worry about messing it up, right? Well, let me just say that Jesus didn't refrain from making commitments. In fact, Jesus came to this earth. He lived with a poor family like we talked about last week. And he even died for our sins. And Jesus didn't have to do any of those things. But he said he was going to, and he followed through with it, and he did. So what I'm telling you today is to be intentional with your commitments and with your words. Don't refrain from making your commitments.